We have an unidentified flying object.
Researcher on a mission with Dr. J. Andy Elias.
We have an unidentified flying object.
All right, everybody, welcome back to Researcher on a Mission. That's right, ROAM Radio. I am your host, Dr. J, and as always, we have a fantastic show for you today. But today is a very special show because we are featuring somebody who truly has had a major impact in my life to start looking things outside the box and specifically challenging mainstream views. And if you have been following this person's books and his work, then you too should be thinking outside the box, because everything that's reported in the mainstream news is not as it is. And to plainly say that everything came about as from Darwinian evolution is also wrong. And this is why this person has been branded as the forbidden archaeologist. Going back to 1993, his first book, Forbidden Archaeology, which really put him on the map, has since then become translated into 26 languages and has sold so millions of copies around the world and is still making an impact today. There are several books in between that book and the most recent book, My Science, My Religion. But without further ado, I think you all should hear from the man himself, and that is Mr. Michael Cremo. Mr. Cremo, welcome to the show.
Good to be with you and all your listeners.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you. I know they've been asking about you for quite some time. I was fascinated when I saw you a little over a year ago, or it might have been a little longer than that, in Contact in the Desert. And I knew at some point in time that we would definitely have to have this interview to dive deeper into your facts, because I think it's just a matter of time before your work becomes the standard. Instead of what we're told from History Channel or National Geographic or any of those, I believe that once people start to look at the facts and evidence more deeply and uncover more fossils, I think that your explanations will end up being the ones that people start quoting. And I wouldn't be surprised 20, 30 years from now, you are given the credit for essentially all of this, I don't want to say rewriting history, but showing the real history. So let me go back to what brought you to write your first book, Forbidden Archaeology. What was it that happened prior to 1993 that made you realize that what we're being told is not necessarily the right way or the correct way things have gone throughout human evolution?
Well, Dr. J, there were a few things that happened before 1993 that influenced me to write that book, Forbidden Archaeology. Part of it has to do with the way I was raised. My father was an officer in the United States Air Force. In the latter part of his career, he was an intelligence officer. So that meant a few things for me as I was growing up. First of all, it meant I was moving around a lot. Our family was moving to different places within the United States and in other countries. So that means I got exposed to a lot of different cultures and worldviews and things like that. So that made me understand there's more than one way to look at things. And the fact that my father was involved in the intelligence business also got me to understand there is such a thing as hidden knowledge that most people simply aren't aware of. So those were some influences on me as I was growing up. And as I said, I got exposed to a lot of different cultures and worldviews. And of course, as you're growing up, eventually you've got to make your own commitments, come up with your own worldview. So among the different worldviews that I was exposed to, the one that made the most sense to me was the spiritual worldview of the ancient culture of India. I became the disciple of a guru from India, and under his guidance I began studying the ancient Sanskrit writings of India, and that's where I encountered the idea of extreme human antiquity. Those ancient historical writings of India tell of vast cycles of time lasting many millions of years, and I learned that humans were present during all of those different vast cycles of time. It was something completely different than anything I had learned from my teachers in high school or university. There I was learning, well, human beings have been present for less than 200,000 years on this planet. Before that time, there were no human beings like us. There were only more primitive ape-like human ancestors that go under different names like Homo erectus and Australopithecus and so on. So in those ancient writings, I was hearing about things that completely contradicted what I had learned from my teachers in school. So I began to wonder, of course, well, what is the real truth? And that's what got me looking into archaeology and the history of archaeology, because if you look in the current textbooks of archaeology, you're only going to see the evidence that supports the now dominant Darwinian evolutionary explanation for human origins, which has human beings like us appearing fairly recently on Earth within the past 200,000 years. But I decided, okay, I'm not going to just stick to what's in the textbooks. I'm going to dig in to the original scientific reports published in the peer-reviewed scientific literature, not just at the textbooks. So when I did that, I found something very amazing. I did about 8 years of research into the whole history of archaeology, and not just in the English language. I have a reading knowledge of most of the major European languages like French, Italian, Spanish, and so on, German. And so I looked at reports from the past 2 centuries and all these different languages. And when I did that, I found that there were many reports of archaeologists and geologists and other earth scientists like paleontologists finding human bones, human artifacts, and human footprints that go much further back in time than 200,000 years ago. So that's what got me started into researching the topic that I call forbidden archaeology.
I'm glad there's a few points I want to comment on that you said. I'm glad you realized, or you were one of the pioneers per se of using archaeology, which is our actual evidence of our humans' history, to decipher what our past has been. Because as you mentioned, the mainstream, I guess, evolution theory is that we Homo sapiens have only been around a short time, as you said, 200,000 years. Prior to us, we evolved from Homo erectus, Neanderthal, and there was another one that you stated. But as you mentioned, several different texts from multiple cultures that in some cases could not have even crossed paths. There would have been no possible way from something from South America to have contact with Egypt 10,000 years ago, or that's just one example of many. But the point I'm trying to get at is they all have a common theme, and it's not what we are told. And the common theme is that were given wisdom and society, or given a push to society by so-called sky people, depending on where you was told. And of course, other arguments are that Homo sapiens were actually walking amongst Neanderthals at the same time. So how can they say we evolved from one species, an ape-like creature, to our current species, when some reports as you mentioned, going back millions of years, report us being there. And that's to me is what blew my mind away, and I never accepted it at face value. Now, I guess we might as well put it out there. What are your views on Charles Darwin and his theory of human evolution?
Well, I think he had some insights, but he didn't have the whole story, and he got a lot of things wrong. In one sense, I have some respect for Charles Darwin, because when he first put out his ideas in his book Origin of Species in 1859, he was in the minority. So you have to respect the man for his courage in promoting an idea that was going against the mainstream views of his time. Of course, now it's 150, 200 years later, it may be time to move on, and his ideas have now become the mainstream. So I've got to respect him on a personal level, but I think he got a lot of things wrong. And it's interesting, some years ago, when I first started lecturing on these topics after my book Forbidden Archaeology was published, somebody at one of my lectures said, Michael, maybe you're a reincarnation of Charles Darwin, and you've had to take birth again to kind of correct your mistake, and that's why you have to give all these lectures contradicting his theory. So I don't know if that's true or not, but it's an interesting idea. I do believe in reincarnation, however, and I think there is a kind of evolution, but it's not the kind that Darwin talked about. And this is something that I talk about in a book that I wrote called Human Devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory. I think there is an evolution of consciousness, an evolution of the soul through different kinds of bodies. Some bodies restrict consciousness more than others. For example, in the body of a tree, a conscious self would be very much restricted in its ability to move. In the body of an animal, the consciousness of a soul would be restricted in its intelligence and abilities. And in the human form, consciousness can be expressed to its fullest. And also it can become free from its contact with matter. So ultimately, I think there is, through the process of reincarnation, a kind of evolution of the conscious self or soul through different bodies until it reaches the human body, in which it has an opportunity to rise to what I call the level of pure consciousness and become free from the cycle of reincarnation. But I don't believe in the kind of evolution that Darwin was talking about, the evolution of one physical body from another. I don't think there's any really good evidence for that. I think, as you were suggesting, that the human form has always been available. There may have been forms of ape men, bodies of ape men, and bodies of apes and monkeys, but the human body, I think, has always been available for conscious selves in this material world to give them the full chance to express all of their innate capacities. And I think that is the real purpose of human life, to raise consciousness to the highest level possible. But, of course, if we just think we're just machines made of molecules, as most Darwinists believe, then there's not a real chance for that.
There's a couple things I want to comment that you just said that are fascinating. First of all, people do need to get with the times, meaning that when new information comes forward, what was once accepted as fact, you have to factor in the new evidence. And therefore, even though Charles Darwin may have been on the right path per se then, obviously with everything that's come forward since, that's obsolete. But you're absolutely right. I also got to hand it to him because he was the minority. He was someone who was persecuted for his beliefs. But now flash forward to this day and age of the 21st century with so much more evidence pointing outside of his theories, I think we absolutely need to start taking those more seriously. The next thing I want to comment on is something you mentioned, which is extremely important, and I've noticed a lot of researchers, lecturers, and listeners the same are picking up on this, and that is consciousness. When scientists try to separate consciousness or spirituality from physical matter. So, for instance, if they're trying to study, like, say, SETI, and they want to study extraterrestrials, but when you try to separate the two, you can't, because I believe they're interrelated. And as you mentioned, when we're in our human form, we can reach the highest level of consciousness, as you coined the term pure consciousness. And it's known that we use such a small percentage of our brain. And I believe that if we used if we were able to access more of it through awakening our consciousness. Some people use meditation. There was a great new film, I don't know if you've seen it, Lucy, which basically essentially shows her using more brain power and what it can do. But I think consciousness is definitely the path that we need to start focusing on more, because there's so much unknown to it. Why did you recognize that consciousness is essentially what we should be paying attention to?
Well, there are a few reasons for that. In one sense, I think we all have experiences. Now, you and I have a little bit of a difference of opinion. In one sense, I am a dualist. I do think consciousness, the conscious self, can exist apart from the body, apart from the brain. I think it has its own independent existence. I don't think that matter produces consciousness. Rather, consciousness has its own independent existence. It can come into association with matter, and it can remain in contact with matter, but it can also separate itself from matter. And some of the reasons for me thinking like that and feeling that that is the real truth have to do with experiences that I've had. I think we all have experiences like these, but a sense of deja vu, a sense that I've been in a place previously in another body different than the one that I have now, or some sense of being out of the body. I remember once I was in Iceland when I was in my 20s. I was in the United States Navy, and I was at a weather station in Iceland, and during my free time, my friends and I, we would go on different expeditions, hiking or camping in the mountains, even in the wintertime. And one winter night, I was with some friends. We were camping in the mountains of Iceland in the middle of winter, and we decided to have a race up to the top of the nearest mountain. Now, these aren't big mountains like Mount Everest or a few thousand feet high, but we decided to do that, and we started going up the icy, snowy side of one of these mountains. And I was kind of winning the race, and I got up near the peak of this mountain, and I slipped, and I fell on my back, and I started going down the slope with my head pointed backwards. And I tried to stop myself, but the momentum was just too much, and I couldn't stop myself from going down the side of this mountain, and I was beginning to think, well, what's going to happen? My head's going to smash into some rock, it's going to break my skull open, or I'm going to go over some cliff, and that's going to be it. And at a certain point, I just realized it's not in my hands anymore, and I just kind of mentally let go. And when I did that, I experienced myself outside of my body, and it was like I could see myself going down the side of the mountain. And then I blacked out, and I woke up at the bottom. My friends were shaking me, and I had a kind of out-of-body experience. So it's things like that made me inclined to accept the idea that there is a conscious self that is the real me, that is different than the body that I'm in. And this idea was reinforced by the teachings of different ancient wisdom traditions that I've studied, especially the ancient Sanskrit text of India, like the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata and the Puranas and things like that. They really deeply explain this idea. And after that, I began looking into scientific evidence that tends to support this idea that there's a conscious self that can exist apart from the body. And that got me into studies of medical investigations, of near-death experiences, psychiatric studies of past life memories, and things like that.
I should probably amend what I said earlier, meaning that, yes, I believe we use a small portion of our brain, and if we used more of it, we can access more things. But I think at the same time, when I meant consciousness, I believe that some people would call it a soul, others would call it a higher self, that it absolutely does go on once this physical body dies, that consciousness will survive and, as you say, reincarnate. And that's what I truly believe, that it isn't independent of our physical being. I just believe that our consciousness can be accessed more greatly if we were able to know how. But you mentioned a few other important points that I'm really glad they were going through my head, and you spoke about them right after. Some people would call it synchronicity. You mentioned your near-death experience where you were sliding down the mountain, and then, of course, having an out-of-body experience, and then some other people would also throw in remote viewing. All things possible when you can use your consciousness to its fullest extent. Can you go into that a little bit? How do you feel about remote viewing and possibly even telepathy, or some people would even go as far as say if we are capable of telekinesis?
I accept the existence of all of those things, and I think we all have these abilities to a certain extent, but it's just like any other talent or ability, mathematical ability or musical ability. Some people have it more than others. We've all got a little bit of musical ability, but not everybody's on the level of a great musical composer like Mozart or Beethoven or someone like that. As far as remote viewing is concerned, I think that's also something that we all possess to some degree or another. Once I was speaking at a conference in Montreal, and one of the other speakers there was someone who had been involved in the remote viewing program that had been run by Stanford Research Institute for Agencies of the United States Government, intelligence agencies, back in the 1970s and 80s. This was Stefan Schwartz. I don't know if you've ever run into his work.
Don't know about him, but I absolutely know about SRI, Stanford Research Institute.
Right. So he was one of the researchers involved in these programs. And, he came to my lecture at the conference, and I came to his, and he had a workshop. And in the workshop, he was making this point that this remote viewing capacity is something that we all have to some extent or another. And there were about 100 of us in the workshop, and he was going to demonstrate this. So what he did was he selected 3 people from the group, told them to get in a car or a taxi, and go anywhere they wanted in the city of Montreal within a 15-minute driving radius. And he gave them a video camera, and he said, go to a place, and then when you're at the place, try to mentally send the imagery to those of us back here in the hotel, in the conference, and also videotape the place that you're at so we can check it out. So the people left, and 15 minutes later, they had gotten wherever they were going to go, and we did an exercise that was guided by Stefan Schwartz. And basically he said, what do you see? He said, clear your mind of everything, and then just start focusing on what you're perceiving. What do you see when you look up? What do you see when you look down? What do you see when you look to the right? What do you see when you look to the left? So on and so forth. And he said, don't edit it, don't question it, just whatever it is that appears in your mental imagery, just put it down. So the first image that came to my mind was candle flames in red glass holders. And my mind was rejecting it like anything. I thought these people had gone to a bowling alley. I was absolutely convinced of it, but I thought, okay, let me just go along with this exercise. So I wrote that down, candle flames in red glass holders, and then I wrote down everything else that came to my mind. So then later, the people came back from where they were, and they put the videotape into a player, and the first image that came onto the screen was candle flames and red glass holders. They'd gone to a cathedral in Montreal, and I believe in this stuff, but I was amazed that I had been able to pick up on that, and about 60% of the people in the room were able to get some features of the place. If you looked at their descriptions, they were capturing some of the features of the place where these people had gone. And sitting next to me at that conference was a scientist named Rupert Sheldrake, who has also investigated some of these paranormal phenomena. He also conducted a workshop that I went to that was kind of interesting.
Some people call this a sixth sense, but these days, more and more people are starting to realize that this may not be a maybe sixth sense, but is probably our first real sense. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, actually I would. And the work of Rupert Sheldrake is interesting in this regard, because he does some very simple experiments that show that we all have these abilities, this so-called sixth sense. And I participated in one of his workshops. And, there's a phenomenon that, many people notice. You feel that somebody's looking at you, looking at the back of your head or something. You turn around and, there's somebody, staring at the back of your head. And I think it's something we've all felt, the sensation that somebody is looking at us, and we look around and, there is somebody doing that. But this can be tested. And the way that it was tested in this workshop, there were about 100 people. He divided us up into groups of 2. So each person had a partner. And the experimental setup kind of went like this. One person was sitting in a chair. The partner was sitting behind the person in another chair, looking at the back of his head or her head, whatever it would happen to be. And the partner had a list of 20 instructions. The instruction might be, look at the person's head, don't look at the person's head, look at the person, look at the person, look, don't look, 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 look. So at each trial, the person in front would have to say whether the person was looking at their head or not. The 20 trials. And, when it was my turn to do it, I think I got it about 75% right. If it's just by chance, if there's no sixth sense, there's no paranormal ability, then you would expect, if you run an experiment like this, people will get it correct 50% of the time. But when such experiments actually are run, and they can be run under very carefully controlled conditions, people tend to get it correct at a rate greatly exceeding 50% of the time. So I think these are abilities that people have, and in some cases, some people have them developed to a very high degree. Now, if you study the yoga scriptures of ancient India, you'll see they talk about different siddhis or mystic perfections that kind of correspond to what we would call paranormal powers. And these might involve things like, there's a word called durdarshan. It's a Sanskrit word. It means see at a distance, kind of like our Greek word television. It's English, but it comes from the Greek, means seeing at a distance. So I think this remote viewing power is a power that we all innately have, but some people have developed more than others.
I think you're absolutely correct in that statement that every single person on this planet and beyond is capable of having all these abilities. The question I have for you is, do you think some people are born with having more access to that sixth, or should be called first sense, or do you think it's possible to be developed versus just having it already in you, per se?
I would say there are people that are born with greater abilities, and it may have been because they've practiced them over many, many lifetimes, or have in some other way gotten a greater capacity to do these things. I think that definitely happens. But according to researchers involved in the remote viewing programs, they are abilities that can be improved with practice. Stephen Schwartz was describing that in recruiting people for the programs that were carried out on behalf of intelligence agencies of the military and civilian branches of the United States government in the 1970s, they would recruit people with some basic ability and then train them to become more sensitive. So apparently it's something that can be worked on.
Now I see why mainstream science would not want us to have this ability, because it essentially would free us. And as you mentioned earlier, being in this form versus a tree per se, we have the ability to have the highest form of consciousness, pure consciousness. Now I'm going to shift back a little bit to something we started talking about near the beginning with regards to your work and your archaeology. A term comes up that's used specifically or with you, and I wanted to ask how it came about and how does it work. And that term is knowledge filter. Can you explain to our listeners what it is and how it works?
Well, in a sense, we all engage in knowledge filtration. In other words, we don't just automatically accept every piece of information that comes to our attention. We have standards for evaluating information and evidence and experiences, and I think we all do that to some extent. Now, there can be ways in which knowledge filtering can be carried out in a discriminatory way that involves double standards. For example, you might have a building inspector, and he's got a book of all kinds of regulations for how electric wiring should be put in and how construction should be carried out, and so that everything's up to code. Now, if he's a fair building inspector, he'll apply those standards equally to each case that he has to evaluate. But if he's biased, he might decide, well, here's my friend, who I've got a business relationship with, and, so for him, I'm going to overlook things. I'm going to be very lenient. I'm not going to enforce all the codes on his building because he's my friend and business partner and whatever. And then this other guy who's our competitor, or he's my rival or enemy, I'm going to enforce the codes on him just to the maximum extent possible and shut his building down. See what I mean?
Yes.
Now, something like that can happen in the world of science, where you have a dominant theory in the education system and scientific institutions, and the supporters of that dominant theory, if they encounter evidence that supports their theory, well, they just let it pass through their knowledge filter, no problem. But if there's evidence that radically contradicts their theory, then they'll ignore it, they'll forget it, they'll put it aside, they'll even attempt to actively suppress the evidence. So there's a kind of bad knowledge filtering that goes on, that operates in the world of science. And I've particularly focused on how it operates in the field of archaeology. So, if you have archaeological evidence that conforms to the dominant theories, well, it passes through the knowledge filter very easily. But if you've got something that radically contradicts it, some discovery of a human bone millions of years old, that contradicts the now dominant theories that humans like us only came into existence about 200,000 years ago. So this knowledge will be filtered out. And that, what that means is we're not getting a complete set of facts with which to make our judgments about what happened in the past, what really happened. So there's a bad effect to this kind of knowledge filtration. And of course, it happens in a lot of different fields. It happens in terms of research into the paranormal, research into extraterrestrials and UFOs and things of that sort as well.
I think it happens with everything, and it goes to basic human instinct. And one major thing I'd like to point out, which is exactly what you sort of implied to, is a theory is just that. It's a theory. If you have new evidence that either supports it or disproves the theory to turn it into a fact, then you can't just overlook it because it goes outside of your box of thinking, or it doesn't help your friend's theory who created it, or anything along the lines of that. Essentially, it's doing a disservice to any field by using that sort of filtering. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, that's what I would say. And in archaeology, there are just some examples that really demonstrate it. I mean, one of my favorite cases is the California gold mine discoveries, where back in the 19th century, you had miners coming to California digging for gold, digging tunnels into the sides of mountains like Table Mountain in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And deep inside these tunnels, the miners were finding human bones, human artifacts, in layers of rock that modern geologists tell us are about 50 million years old, from the early Eocene period. And these discoveries came to the attention of the chief government geologist of California, Dr. J.D. Whitney, and he went out, he visited the sites, he conducted his own personal investigations, he documented the discoveries that had been made by others, and he wrote a massive book about them that was published by Harvard University in the year 1880. But we don't hear very much about these discoveries today because of the process of knowledge filtration. You know, there was another scientist, a contemporary of Dr. Whitney's. His name was William Holmes. He was an anthropologist working at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, and he wrote, if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of human evolution, he wouldn't have published that report, despite the imposing array of testimony with which he was confronted. And I'll translate that. I mean, if the evidence didn't support the theory of evolution, then it should simply be ignored, forgotten. It shouldn't have been reported at all. It should have been cast into oblivion. And basically, that's what happened. So in my book, Forbidden Archaeology, what I've done is I've brought forward cases that have two aspects. One, the first thing is that they are, in terms of their age, outside the boundaries of the mainstream theories. And then second, I try to show exactly how the knowledge filtering process worked in each particular case. So in the case of the California gold mine discoveries, it was the opinions of highly placed scientists like Holmes, Dr. Holmes, who just admitted the reason he was rejecting these California gold mine discoveries is because they contradicted the theory that he accepted, the Darwinian theory of human evolution.
Again, going back to the word theory, and that's just that. And if a scientist is out there gathering evidence, even if it opposes the so-called theory, then how can they get to a conclusive fact if they overlook evidence that doesn't support that theory? Which is why I stress the word theory, because it's just that, a theory. Let's speak about your theory of evolution, or the challenging the Darwinian evolution, because this day and age, so many people are starting to realize that what's written in mainstream science and even in religions is not really how we came about. And exactly as you mentioned with the gold mines, it being suppressed, finding the bones in there because it didn't make sense to us evolving from Homo erectus or Neanderthal or whatever else was on that plane, as opposed to showing where we probably had a time where Homo sapiens were walking alongside or maybe in different areas of the world. But what is your theory of human evolution per se, or how we got here, how we got to being on this planet?
Well, that's a question that many people began asking me after they read the book Forbidden Archaeology. They would say, okay, you have all this evidence contradicting the current theories of human origins. Where do you think, and how do you think humans like us came into existence? And to answer that to answer that question, I wrote a book called Human Devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory. And basically what I propose is before we even ask the question, where did human beings come from, we should first of all ask the question, what is a human being? Now, many scientists today are going to say that a human being or any other living thing is simply a machine made of molecules. We're purely material beings. We're just combinations of molecules. There's an English evolutionary scientist named Richard Dawkins who put it very nicely. He said, we're survival machines. We're robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes. So they're giving a really materialistic explanation of who we are and where we came from. But I don't accept that. And interestingly enough, there are even some atheistic philosophers and scientists who don't accept that. For example, Thomas Nagel, who is a prominent philosopher at New York University here in the United States, he wrote recently a book called Mind and Cosmos, which I found very interesting. The subtitle of the book is Why the Neo-Darwinian Evolutionary Explanation of the Origin of Life in the Universe is Most Probably Wrong. And he was pointing out it really doesn't account for the origin of consciousness, for example. That is a huge problem. If you've just got matter, how do you get consciousness? So even as an atheist and a materialist, he was recognizing the problem. And it sort of got him into trouble with a lot of people in the academic and scientific world for saying that, which is something that, as I said, that got him in a little bit of trouble. But the reason that I'm bringing it out is because some people will think, well, it's just spiritual people and people with commitments, religious commitments, that are having problems with the current theories. But there are even many atheists and materialists who are having problems with the current theories, especially their inability to account for the existence of consciousness. So what I'm proposing is, if we look at what a human being is, we see it's not just a combination of material atoms. That's part of what a human being is. Matter is part of who we are and what we are, but it's not the whole story. Beyond that, there's a subtle mental body with some very unusual powers, like telepathy and psychokinesis and remote viewing and things like that. And then beyond that, there's a conscious self that is completely non-material. So a human being is made of matter, mind, and consciousness. And when I speak of mind and consciousness, I don't mean temporary byproducts of bioelectrical activity in the brain, as most scientists now believe. They think, yes, there is consciousness, but it's just produced by brain chemistry. And when the chemicals in the brain stop interacting at the time of death, then there's no more mind, there's no more consciousness, it's just all molecules. So I don't accept that. I think go ahead.
I was going to say, to call a human being just that, a bunch of molecules, is sort of ludicrous to me. And I heard an interesting analogy, and I was going to ask you what you think of this. Someone said, think of the body, including the brain, every organ, as an airplane, and your mind/consciousness, which you could separate, or if you really put together, that would be the airplane that drives the body. What do you think of that statement?
I think that's a good way to look at it. There are a lot of different analogies, that we could use to look at the relationship between consciousness, the mind, and the body. I sometimes use a computer analogy. I compare the gross physical body, made of the chemical elements like phosphorus and iron and calcium and so on, to the computer hardware. And the mental body I compared to the computer software that allows a user to interact with the hardware for different purposes. And the computer user I compare to the actual conscious self who is using the software and the hardware for his or her purposes. So to get back to where, if we're going to explain where human beings came from, we have to explain, well, where did this consciousness come from? Where did mind come from? How did they all come together in the human form, matter, mind, and consciousness? So what I'm proposing is that the real human self is that conscious self. It has a non-material origin. It originates on what I call the level of pure consciousness. So in that sense, we're all extraterrestrials. As conscious selves, none of us are from here. And that conscious self has no birth, no death, no beginning, no end. It's always existing. It has the quality of eternality or timelessness. And on that level of pure consciousness, it exists in loving harmony with all other conscious selves and the source of all conscious selves. If a conscious self becomes egotistical or selfish, domineering, exploiting, controlling, it can no longer exist in that harmonious state. So there has to be some other field of activity for it, and that is the world of matter. And it can't use its original form of pure consciousness to act in a dominating, exploiting kind of way, a selfish kind of way, because it's not built for that. It's built for acting in loving harmony with other conscious selves. So it has to have another kind of vehicle, and those vehicles are what we call bodies made of matter. For example, if as a human being, I normally live on the land, I walk around on the land. If I want to live in an alien element like water, if I want to live in the water, then I need a vehicle that will allow me to function in the water. I need a diving suit or some kind of submarine vehicle or something that will allow me to function under the water. So in the same way, if a conscious self comes to the world of matter, it needs a vehicle that will allow it to function on this level of reality. So I think there's a higher intelligence involved in everything. You could call it God. I call it a supreme conscious self that provides these vehicles for conscious selves to have when they come to the world of matter. So to put it just in its most brief form, I would say the real self is the conscious self, and it doesn't evolve up from matter, as most scientists now believe. I don't think matter can produce consciousness. Consciousness has its own independent existence. It can come in contact with matter. And that process of the pure conscious self coming into contact with matter is what I call devolution. So as conscious selves, we don't evolve up from matter. Rather, we devolve or come down from the level of pure consciousness. But it's a process that can be reversed, and consciousness can be restored to its original pure state. And there are different systems of meditation and contemplation and yoga that are meant to help a conscious self do that. But we get distracted from these things because of the heavily materialistic climate of our current worldwide human civilization. And the leaders of that worldwide human civilization would rather see us completely involved in producing and consuming more and more material things, because that benefits them in terms of their financial and economic and political systems. They wouldn't want to see substantial numbers of people diverting energy that could be involved in material production and consumption into things like raising the level of consciousness, living more simply and naturally and peacefully in this world. That wouldn't be good for the current system.
There's a few things that you said that I think are just so fascinating. First of all, your analogy of a computer, hardware, software, and us operating it, I think is much better than the airplane pilot analogy, because yours covers all three elements versus just two, merging mind and consciousness. And then with regards to the material distractions that we have on this planet, some would say that the leaders of them, just as you said, they would want us to be more materialistic, buy into more products or whatever it does to keep us under control, and also to increase their wealth and power. Why do you think? I think I have an idea, and I'm hoping you could explain this for the listeners. Why do you think they would want us to suppress, aside from the materialistic points of view, suppress our ability to access this consciousness, or better yet, should I say, to increase our awareness of this consciousness that we've always had and for eternity?
Well, I think it goes against their economic and political interests to have people do that. I mean, the basic trend of our society has been to monetize everything, monetize every human activity. It used to be that, well, you could think, okay, I'm working, but then I go home and I've got, my friends and my social activities, and that's personal. That's not monetized. It's not part of the economic and political system. But that's all been changing. I guess the great genius of entrepreneurs in the past couple of decades is they've been able to monetize people's social activities that used to be completely private. Your relationships with your friends and your family, they figured out how to monetize that. and how far it's going to go, whether they're going to be able to monetize your interior thoughts, we're just going to have to see. But things are kind of trending in that direction. And what that means is that practically everything that a person does now is somehow or other contributing to the financial and political power and interest of certain narrow groups who are in charge of all this. So it's really pretty amazing. But I think the reason why a lot of these alternative ideas are being so heavily resisted is because they tend to involve some spiritual principles, and they involve non-material concepts of the self that if people took really seriously would result in people trying to, instead of overproducing and over-consuming material things, people would be trying to figure out on a national and international level how to satisfy their material needs in the most simple, natural, and efficient way possible. And they would also be looking for ways to not divide themselves into different competing and warring groups. They would be looking to establish their unity on the level of consciousness. I'm a being of pure consciousness. You're a being of pure consciousness. On that level, we're all part of the same spiritual family. No need to divide ourselves into so many competing groups on the basis of race or nationality or religion even. That unfortunately happens from time to time. So I think there are powerful interests that want to keep people divided into groups, competing with each other for the maximum degree of exploitation of material resources that generate wealth that flows unfairly into the hands of a few at the expense of the many.
Mr. Cremo, you hit some points that are honestly so fascinating, and to me, on point of what I've been paying attention to for years now. First of all, monetizing our thoughts. If you just Google something, then the next time you go on your computer or 5 minutes later you go onto another website, an ad's going to pop up of what you just searched. And I don't know if you know this, but Amazon recently has opened shipping hubs. So therefore, instead of having their mainstream or big warehouses where everything is shipped from, I think there's a handful of them across the country, now there's smaller ones in cities, and the reason is they use your past history of what you've ordered and your Google searches and everything else to essentially predict what you're going to buy. So they may not be on the direct level of reading our thoughts, but essentially that's a way of monetizing what we're doing. And I think that's a wrong way, because it kind of takes away a little bit of our privacy if you look at it from that point of view. Another thing that you mentioned that I think is really, really important is this primitive tribal warfare. Again, we are all brothers and sisters of consciousness. And I keep going back to a statement that everybody recalls this, by Ronald Reagan, made twice. Once at, I think, a high school graduation commencement ceremony, the second being at the UN, and that was if we were faced by an alien threat from above, wouldn't we all come together and forget our petty little differences and fight off this threat? And sometimes I'm wondering if that's what's needed for us to come together, or do we really have to wait for a threat or some sort of fear? Isn't there another way that everybody on Earth can recognize that we are all one?
Well, I would hope so. I mean, but it's very difficult in the current climate. And I think this is part of the role that the dominance of the Darwinian theory of evolution and the education systems around the world and in the scientific institutions. I think this is the role that it plays, because basically what that theory is telling us is we are machines made of matter in competition with each other for survival. So I think it's that mentality that is at least partially responsible for the intense levels of conflict that we see on all levels of human society. We see conflict among individuals, conflict among races, conflict among nations, conflict among classes, conflict among religions. If in all the schools around the world people are being taught, you're machines made of matter, you're robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes, as Richard Dawkins so nicely puts it, then I think if that's the propaganda that's being indoctrinated, if you've got huge populations being indoctrinated with this idea that, yeah, you're purely material beings, you're machines made of molecules in competition with each other for survival, then it's going to be a little difficult to get people to see their essential spiritual oneness and identity with each other. But that's the struggle that's always gone on since time began. I think there have always been two kinds of conscious selves in this material level of reality where we find ourselves at the present moment. There's one type of conscious self that's trying to get deeper and deeper into selfishness, conflict, domination, control, etc. And then there's another type of conscious self that's trying to understand, I'm a being of pure consciousness, all others are beings of pure consciousness, no need to divide ourselves up into so many competing groups, no need to put all of our human energy into ever-increasing material production and consumption. Let's try to find out how we can produce the material needs for all of us in the most simple, natural, and efficient way possible, so we can put most of our human energy into developing that resource of consciousness. So there are those two kinds of conscious selves. I think we can recognize them. Those that are going deeper and deeper into material identification, dividing themselves into competing groups, overproducing, overconsuming, destroying the planet in terms of the environment, causing more and more conflict in the world and more disparity between people, and those who are working in another way, to try to find out what is the path to unity and real human consciousness on this planet.
I now that we were able to essentially define what humans are, and I wholeheartedly agree with you and disagree with the scientists that say we're nothing but matter, because I absolutely believe that our consciousness, or some would call it a soul, lives on for eternity. It never dies, never has died. It's always been there in one way, shape, or form, whether it's existed as another bipedal being on another planet, or as a plant or a fish somewhere. It keeps going and going. Now that we've defined that, let's talk about evolution now. Going back to Darwin's theory, what would your interpretation be of how we came about? And essentially the next thing that would be is, how are the mainstream scientists taken in this new information? Because as we know from this knowledge filtering, anything that's going to challenge the way they've been thinking for ever since Darwin's theory has been accepted is kind of sort of tossed out the window, which is sad.
Well, basically what the Darwinist scientists say, and those who go along with them say, is they're trying to explain everything in terms of matter only. There are two things that they don't like. Non-material substance. They want to try to avoid that at all costs. The idea that there's something that fundamentally exists in the universe other than atoms and subatomic particles. They resist that like everything, like anything. And then the other thing that they resist is any idea that there's a guiding intelligence that has something to do with the order and complexity that we observe around us today. The whole project of science for the past few centuries has been to eliminate non-material substance, subtle energies, consciousness, spirit, soul. They don't like that. They want to eliminate all of that, and they have been. And then the other thing they've tried to eliminate is the idea of higher intelligence having anything to do with what we observe around us. And Darwin's major contribution was to eliminate the need for higher intelligence to explain bodies of living things. The bodies of living things are extremely complex. They're more complex than the most amazing machines that humans can manufacture. If you actually look at what's going on the biomolecular level of a human being or any other living thing, or even the simplest living thing, simple one-celled bacterium or amoeba, it's amazingly complex. So complex that we really can't duplicate the kinds of things. Nobody has manufactured a cell. Nobody has explained how that actually came about, although it's in all the textbooks somehow or other. From just chemicals in the Earth's early oceans, you get self-reproducing single-celled organisms somehow or other. So I think that really doesn't work. To really explain what we observe around us, we can't avoid bringing in the idea of some non-material substance being part of what a living being is, some subtle energies, some vital forces, consciousness existing apart from matter. I think to have a real science, you have to bring in those things. And I think you also cannot avoid the idea that there has to be some intelligence involved in how these things come together. So, of course, these things are very much opposed by the current dominant materialistic scientific establishment. Of course, there are people who are proposing, there are scientists who are proposing intelligent design. There are scientists who are proposing the need for non-material substance, but they're being very much oppressed under the current climate. So, I don't know if that's exactly answering your question.
It is, and you actually said exactly what I was saying initially in the beginning, that current scientists trying to separate matter from non-materialistic a substance such as consciousness or soul, I think is not going to get us anywhere. You have to study both, or the combination of them, or the interaction between the two, because if you just study matter, you're going to hit a brick wall. And I think that's why we don't have the understanding that we do have, or that we should be able to have. And it is pioneers such as yourself that are opening up the doors for others to take a look. And this is exactly the reason why I asked to interview you, because when I read your book, Forbidden Archaeology, you really got me going. And of course, following up with that and watching your lectures and everything else I can read and paying attention to other researchers along the same lines of that, I just don't think you can separate material matter or material substance from non-material substance because they're so interrelated. And in some cases, in my personal beliefs, I think sometimes the non-material substance actually is more important because that's the part of you that never goes away. That's the part of you that will continue to go on, and that will at some point replace the sixth sense and move it up to the first sense. That's what I believe. Now, another question I want to ask you is the origin of humans. Some people believe, as you mentioned, the intelligent design. Jim Marrs recently spoke on his new book, Our Occulted History, where we were intelligently designed by extraterrestrials that came from another planet that used, I don't know if they merged their DNA and what was local to create the modern-day Homo sapien. And then, of course, there is some mainstream scientists, or I think the general accepted one, is that we just sort of came about from chemical reactions on this planet, as you said, starting from single-celled beings. And even, I recall, as you said, amoebas, those, even though they have one cell, there is so much going on there that, and I don't know how you could take the leap to say that, yes, you've given, billions of years, but to create from going from one thing or a handful of living organisms to the millions of types of organisms ranging from insects to trees to all of the mammals and to everything. I don't get there. So what do you think, in your personal opinion, and from all the work you've studied and uncovered through your years as an archaeologist, has led you to believe where we came from?
Well, ultimately, forbidden archaeology just presented archaeological evidence that contradicts the current theories. Discoveries of human bones, human artifacts, human footprints that go back many, many millions of years, tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of years. And the significance of that is that it means we need new explanations for human origins. Now, of course, in my book, Forbidden Archaeology, I didn't present any particular alternative because I wanted people to be free to think for themselves what kind of alternative explanations they might offer. So I of course, I have my own ideas about what the alternative is or should be, and I reserved another book for that. But I wanted people who read Forbidden Archaeology to be free to think up what they thought would be reasonable. And there are different ideas that people have come up with. One would be a new theory of evolution where you have humans evolving hundreds of millions of years ago and things like that. Other ideas people have come up with to explain the evidence include time travel. And so I'm happy that people are considering all those things. I mean, my ideas are expressed in my book, Human Devolution. And basically, I'm proposing there you have to bring in the idea of non-material substance, a subtle mental body and a conscious self that can exist apart from matter. That you have to bring into it. But then, how do the bodies for conscious selves come into existence? I think those are designed by a higher intelligence in the universe. Just like, say, an automobile manufacturing company, on the basis of their understanding of the needs of various kinds of people, they design and build a whole range of vehicles, not just one type of vehicle, but many types of vehicles. So I think there's a higher conscious intelligence in the universe that understands that when conscious selves come to the world of matter, they're going to need vehicles made of matter to allow them to function on this level of reality. But each conscious self is different. It has different desires. It has different impulses. So with that in mind, knowing the full range of desires and impulses that conscious selves in the world of matter would manifest, that higher intelligence in the cosmos, you could call it God if you like, provided a full range of vehicles, plant vehicles, fish vehicles, insect vehicles, different kinds of animal vehicles, human vehicles, for conscious selves to occupy in the world of matter. Now, once the first ones are produced, they go on to reproduce themselves. So, ultimately, where I would say the human body and all other bodies come from they all came from a higher conscious intelligence in the universe that understood that when conscious selves come to the world of matter, they're going to need different kinds of vehicles to allow them to function here. But the human vehicle is a very special one, because in that human vehicle, a conscious self can understand where it really came from and where it really should be going. And it can, if it uses that human vehicle for that purpose, it achieves the real success of life. Of course, that human vehicle can be used for other purposes as well. It can be used for becoming more and more deeply entangled in matter. It's a dual function vehicle, but we should use it for its higher function rather than its lower function.
And yet our mainstream science is trying to suppress us from using our higher function in many ways, both by keeping us distracted by materialism, and some even go as far to say as dumbing us down literally by chemicals in our foods, genetically modified organisms, and all sorts of things to prevent us from actually sitting down or going to nature and quietly meditating and expanding our consciousness. Would you agree that this whole genre of work is being suppressed? Because I believe yours work is being suppressed by the mainstream scientists. But let's just talk about suppression in general. Do you believe that it's being suppressed? We talked about the material distractions and wealth and money, but for reasons that I think that if we're able to unlock the capabilities of telepathy and telekinesis and other things such as that manifestation, I think that would be a great threat to those in power. And I think that's my personal view of why the suppression would be there. Would you agree with that statement?
Yes, I do agree with that. I think the problem is that several centuries ago, certain decisions were made within the scientific community. Because if you go back 500 or 600 years ago, even in the Western world, in Europe, the scientific worldview incorporated subtle energies, different levels of and dimensions of reality, higher beings operating on the higher levels of reality, non-material substance in the form of a conscious self or soul. All these things were part of the worldview of modern science, or not modern, but pre-modern Western science. If you go back to the time of, even up to the time of Newton, which is only 300 years ago, Newton, the father of modern physics, was writing about alchemy and subtle energies and all kinds of things that are kind of excluded from the scientific textbooks today. But as I said, around that time, a few centuries ago, scientists decided they were going to concentrate on the gross material elements, the ones that are described in the periodic table of elements, iron and calcium and phosphorus, and they were only going to focus on discovering mathematically describable laws, and they wanted to know how to control and exploit these gross material elements. So that was productive for science in many ways. By concentrating on the mathematically describable interactions of the purely material elements, they were able to get a lot of control over it. They were able to develop technologies and weapons and consumer products. So the governments of the world liked that. They liked the ability of scientists to provide them with technologies, particularly military technologies. So the governments liked that very much. Now, there were also around 300 or 400 years ago, or 500 years ago, corporations forming. And these corporations, they were based on buying and selling different things. So when they discovered that scientists could provide them with things that they could sell and market to people, they liked that a lot. And then the people in general were also complicit. You know, you could say the military, the government, the corporations, but we were also part of this whole bargain. The general public got a lot of stuff it liked, you know, from this decision by material scientists by the scientific community to focus on the strictly material elements and their interactions. So basically, you've got a situation where the governments like it because they get weapons of mass destruction, atomic bombs, jet aircraft, you know, communications equipment. You know, they get all this stuff. The corporations like it because they get stuff they can sell to people. And another thing the scientific community was able to do was develop pharmaceuticals and medical techniques that drove out the medical systems that were based on the understanding of subtle energies and non-material substances. You know, so you get this whole system that's built up. Now, but you get it at the cost of not having a complete picture of reality. You get it at the expense of denying the real spiritual essence of living things. So you get environmental destruction, economic cycles of depressions and things like that, and you get a destroyed environment. So out of this focus on the purely material aspect of things by science, society gets a lot of so-called advancement, but at an extreme cost of denying the real essence of human life, dividing people up into competing groups, so many wars, and you get also class divisions and exploitation of the consumers and the ordinary people by those highly placed in the system and able to command most of the wealth. And you also get this succession of wars and conflicts. So there's a price for all this success. And I think the way to get a more balanced picture is you have to get science to revisit this decision it made to focus on the purely material aspect of things.
One key thing you said that triggered in my head right away is when you said Western countries or Westerners. There is such a dichotomy between Western and Eastern religions and cultures, and it seems to me that the Eastern society as a whole has essentially not let go of their past, what they were doing thousands of years ago with meditation, or, for instance, the Buddhists, which are more recent, not having material items as distractions and looking in within themselves, or healing themselves with subtle energies or other forces, as opposed to big pharmaceuticals like the Western countries. Why do you think there's such a dichotomy? Do you think it's, again, what you just said, because of these giant corporations and governments and pharmaceuticals and military that want to keep us away from what we actually access? Or is it just a coincidence that the Easterners were able to preserve all their knowledge, whereas we lost it as we came to the New World, per se?
Well, I think that is partially true, but we have to keep in mind that what we call the West extended its influence over the entire world. You know, the British and the French and the Portuguese, they conquered India. They established their rule over China. The French established their rule over Indochina, Southeast Asia, many of the Buddhist countries. The Dutch and others established their dominance over Indonesia and that part of the world. You know, so you have, the Western culture and way of life established worldwide dominance. Now, even despite that, some of these cultures were able to preserve some of their values. But I would say even in the West, if you go back, a few centuries, you'll see that their picture of the world and the universe and the place of life within the universe was much like that of traditional spiritual cultures in other parts of the world. I think you were commenting in the very beginning of the show how a lot of the different ancient wisdom traditions have these similarities. I think the reason for that is they were all approaching the same spiritual realities from their own particular perspectives. Therefore, there's some underlying similarity between them, but also some cultural differences.
You've been to several places. Like you said in the beginning, you spent 8 years in India, which led you on a spiritual journey and culminated in your first book. You're an archaeologist. You find artifacts or fossils, and you analyze them, look at them. Speaking specifically with forbidden archaeology, what is the best piece of evidence you found? And then I'm going to extend that question to ask you, post that book to now, what are some of the other most fascinating items or places or fossils that you've come across, pieces of evidence, to be broad?
Well, in the case of forbidden archaeology, it wasn't necessarily one single case that impressed me as being, the best one, really. To me, the most significant thing was that there were hundreds of these cases. That's what really astonished me when I started. When I started doing the research for forbidden archaeology, I wasn't sure what I was really going to find. Thought I might encounter in my study of the history of archaeology a few interesting cases, and maybe I'd write a short article about it. Do 8 days of research and write 8 pages about it, and then go on to some other topic. But as I got into the research, one case just led to another, so that my 8 days of research turned into 8 weeks, turned into 8 months, turned into 8 years, ultimately. And my final report on my research, it went from 8 pages to 80 pages to over 800 pages. The book Forbidden Archaeology is over 900 pages long. So what really impressed me was not, one particular case, but the fact that there were hundreds of these cases that had been processed by this knowledge filter and therefore excluded, from today's textbooks. So that was what really astonished me. Of course, among those cases, I do have my favorites. I mentioned one of them on the show already, the California gold mine discoveries of human bones and human artifacts and layers of rock 50 million years old. I was also impressed by the case of the discoveries of Virginia Steen McIntyre, who was an American geologist who was called to date an archaeological site in Mexico. And, she got an age that was too old for the mainstream theorists to accept, so she really suffered from it. Her career was practically finished because of this. But I'm happy to say that because of giving her case some publicity in my book Forbidden Archaeology, new research eventually was done at the site in Mexico. It's called Huayatlaco, that confirmed the dates that she and her colleagues originally got for it. So, yeah, I do have my favorite cases, but what really impressed me was the massive amount of evidence that has been suppressed in the field of human antiquity. And since the book Forbidden Archaeology was published, new cases have come to my attention, and I'm in the process of writing a book. I think I'm going to call it More Forbidden Archaeology, that incorporates the evidence that's come to my attention since that first book was published. I mean, one interesting case that'll be in the book came to my attention last year. Researchers in England uncovered human footprints on a beach at a place called Happisburgh in the United Kingdom. And those footprints were found in sediments over 900,000 years old. But the footprints, in terms of their form and shape, were just like those of modern human footprints. Now, of course, the natural conclusion would be that humans like us were present 900,000 years ago in England. But that's not the conclusion that was reached by the scientists who studied those footprints. They thought, well, they must belong to some kind of ape man. They don't believe that humans like us were present 900,000 years ago. The current idea is that humans like us first came into existence less than 200,000 years ago. So even though the footprints were, in terms of their shape, just like those of modern humans, they decided to attribute them to an ape man called Homo antecessor, who they believe lived in Europe at that time. So the knowledge filtering process is still going on. The theories determine how the evidence is evaluated, rather than the evidence determining what the theories are.
And that's the sad part, because it should be exactly as you said. It should be the other way around, where the evidence should be determining the theories. That is why they are called theories. There's something, they're a hypothesis, they're an idea that you bring evidence to support it to eventually make it into a fact. So if you're ignoring or filtering out facts that contradict the theory, then someone needs to overlook or relook the theory over and maybe form a new one. And speaking of suppression, we talked about why the governments and why corporations and society, specifically our society, would want to suppress this. What have they done to suppress your books and your work specifically?
Well, this does happen from time to time. Now, the first thing I'm going to say is, on one level, I do respect the right of each individual to make up their own minds about these things, and people can agree with me or disagree with me. That's fine on that level. But in terms of reactions to my work from the scientific community, basically there's been three kinds of reactions, because not all scientists are the same. There's one group of scientists that I call the fundamentalist materialist, and they're very much opposed to what I do. They don't want to hear it. They don't want anyone else to hear it. Sometimes, I've got a lecture scheduled somewhere, and they'll try to get it canceled. This happened to me, for example, in Russia. You mentioned my books are now published in over 20 different languages. One of the languages is Russian. And I've been to Russia several times. I've spoken at universities all over that country. But and most of the time, there's no problem. But in one particular case, I was scheduled to give a lecture at one particular university. Some professors there had invited me to speak. But then, shortly before the lecture was to be given, other professors at the university objected. And they went to the president of the university and they convinced him to cancel the lecture. And they objected to my presence for two reasons. First of all, I was contradicting the theory of evolution. And second, I was doing it from a spiritual perspective. I'm quite open about my work being largely inspired by my studies in the Vedic text of ancient India. So the professors who invited me tried to get the president of the university to change his mind, but the opposition from the other side was too great, so the lecture was canceled. Now, fortunately, the professors who invited me, they went to the local branch of the Russian Academy of Sciences, and the director there said, well, if they won't let him speak at the university, he can speak here. So they staged the lecture there, and they had buses bring students and professors from the university. And the professors who invited me said more people came than would have come if the lecture had been held at the university. So things like that do happen. They happen in the United States as well. Last year, I was invited to speak at Google headquarters in Mountain View. The company has a program whereby employees can invite authors to speak as part of a lecture series. They have authors at Google. When I was invited, some of the employees of Google objected and tried to get the lecture canceled. Basically, they were of this group that I call the fundamentalist materialist. So that's one group, and yes, they do try to suppress my lectures and books and things like that. And if that didn't happen, I wouldn't be able to call my topic Forbidden Archaeology. If you don't get forbidden once or twice a year, I'd have to call my book something else. But fortunately, these fundamentalist materialists are not the only people in science. There are some scientists who support the current theories, but they're open-minded enough to be able to listen to an alternative idea and consider it rationally. Whereas this first group, I think they're committed to the current theories not for purely scientific reasons, but for more or less ideological reasons. Because the current theories appear to support their prior belief in atheism and materialism. But this other group of scientists, they are responsible for my ability to speak at universities around the world, at scientific conferences. Actually, my latest book, My Science, My Religion, is a collection of 24 papers that I presented on the kinds of things we've been talking about on this show at major international scientific conferences. So that group of scientists is open-minded enough to be able to be willing to listen to new ideas. And I think that's important, because if ideas are going to change, the first thing is scientists and others have to be willing to listen to new ideas. And among those who do listen, there are some scientists who agree with me. But, of course, they're very few in number, and that's what you'd expect in the world today. So, fortunately, people have a lot of ways they can get information these days. There are a lot more channels of communication that are open to people, like this show, for example, and others like it. People can get their own information. And eventually, I think it's going to result in some changes in the curriculum in the tax-supported education systems around the world, and even some changes in the scientific institutions themselves.
It's really sad that that first group that really don't want to ruin or to have anything that would disprove their theory, because again, just going back to that same point that I've been saying throughout this entire show, it's just a theory, and whenever new facts come to light, you have to incorporate them. So for those who went as far as to cancel one of, or to persuade the president to cancel one of your lectures, that's just sad at the very least. Thankfully, there was supporters, and this would actually lead into my next question, which was how has your work influenced scientists, academics, and the general public at large? Because I know how your work has influenced me. This is exactly why we're doing this show. And going back to another statement that you made with alternative media, thankfully these days we have access to reach millions of people, whereas 30, 40, 50 years ago, you could only have a handful of networks, whether it be television or radio, that were controlled by a handful of corporations. And those would censor, I think, a lot of the information, because what you would hear on a network such as this, you're not going to hear on CNN or Fox. And the rise of networks such as these, the rise of YouTube and other alternative media forms, is really opening up the eyes of the world at large.
Yeah, well, I think you're right about that. I mean, there are some positive developments. Now, I kind of got away from the very first thing that you said in terms of what you were asking me about Sometimes that happens when I'm listening to an announcer. I was sorry.
No problem at all. I was saying I know how your work has influenced me. How do you think it's how do you think it's influencing other scientists and other academics as well as the
Well,
world?
I don't want to exaggerate, the kind of influence that I've had, but I think one way to judge it is to look at the kinds of invitations I've had to speak at scientific institutions like the Royal Institution in London, the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow, and others. So it does show that at least some scientists are interested in hearing alternative ideas, which is positive. Another way of judging the kind of influence that I've had is to look at the number of presentations I've been able to make at mainstream scientific conferences in archaeology, history of science, consciousness studies, and others. How these things work is that you have to make a proposal that gets evaluated by an academic committee. And I've had dozens of my proposals to present papers at mainstream academic scientific conferences be accepted, which means to me there are a certain number of open-minded scientists who are willing to allow alternative ideas like mine, for example, to be presented in the official forums of these scientific disciplines. Now that's something positive, and as I said a little bit earlier, a way for listeners to get some sense of that would be to look at my latest book, My Science, My Religion, which is a collection of 24 papers that I've presented on these topics at mainstream international scientific conferences. And some of those papers have been published in peer-reviewed scientific publications. Now, I think that shows there has been some influence of my work even within the mainstream scientific circles. I don't want to exaggerate it or give the impression that overwhelming numbers of people within these disciplines are agreeing with me. They're not. But at least some of them are willing to listen to alternative ideas. And I think that's something that can be built on in the future. Now, of course, among the general public, I would say the majority of the general public already agree with many of the things that I'm saying. There have been Gallup surveys done in the United States, for example, that show most of the American people do not agree with the Darwinian theory of evolution. Most of the people in America think that human beings have been around since the beginning of life on this planet. Most of the American people, for example, have had different kinds of paranormal experiences. And so I think most people already agree with the kinds of things that I'm saying. And I think this is really significant. You've got a scientific elite that is in control of the education system, but still, even though they've been in total control of the education system for 100 years or more, still most people have opinions and beliefs and convictions that contradict what they're saying. So I think that's not a very stable position for some kind of elite to be in, where although they're officially in control, most people disagree with them. So I think eventually people are going to try to see that the people who are in control of the education system more accurately reflect their own convictions and opinions about a lot of these questions.
We only have a few minutes left, so I know I'm going to run out of time because I have so many more questions to ask you. So if it would be okay, at some point I would love to continue more on this. But let me get to a couple. First of all, you are not exaggerating when you're talking about your influence, because to have your work being published in peer-reviewed journals is as big as you can get in academics or for any of those involved in academia. So I definitely think it's a huge step. Another thing you mentioned is now in the 21st century, more people are challenging the Darwinian theory of evolution, our origins, and everything else that we have been fed as to be told as fact for the last 50, 100, 200 years or so on. And so I think now's the time when everything is ripe and everybody's minds are ripe to be opened up with this knowledge. So all the work you've been doing is doing nothing but fueling those people who want this knowledge. And they cannot overlook physical archaeology. When you find bones, for instance, in the California gold mines, or what you were talking about, Victoria Steen McIntyre, who found 900,000-year-old bones in Mexico, you can't overlook things like that. And that's why I think it's so fascinating, all the work you've done. Mr. Cremo, it has been such an honor to speak to you, and I wanted to give you the last minute or so to basically tell people what's next for you and where they can find you.
The best place for people to find out about me and my work is my website, mcremo.com, mcremo.com. I also have a presence on Facebook and Twitter. As far as what's coming up for me, I'm going to be a speaker on a cruise to Alaska in June 2015. If people want information about that, they can go to spiritualcruise.com. And if they do decide to accompany me on that cruise, where I'll be speaking about my work, along with the work of other healers and psychics and researchers in alternative history, if they decide to come along, they could give me as their referral. That would be very much appreciated. I'm working on a new book called More Forbidden Archaeology. I guess that's...
Well, Mr. Cremo, Michael Cremo, everybody, the forbidden archaeologist, definitely a pioneer, that's someone who's influenced me and is clearly influencing everybody else out there. I highly suggest you have an opportunity to go see Mr. Cremo speak, as I had the opportunity at Contact in the Desert. I don't know if it was 2013 or 2014. Point being is he's a fascinating man, and I truly hope you've all enjoyed this interview, and there will be more to come. Keep on, go to drjradiolive.com so you could see the schedule for future interviews as well as archives. This show will be there on YouTube in a matter of weeks, as well as all the other shows with Edgar Mitchell, Michael Dukakis, Linda Moulton Howe, and so many others, everybody. So again, this has been a fascinating time. And with that being said, this is Dr. J signing out.